You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. We are, if you can believe it, nearing the end of an era. Anne Hidalgo, mayor since 2014, will soon be leaving office. And this month, we vote on her replacement. In fact, there are elections all over the country. But in Paris, there are some changes to how that's going to go down, and also who is likely to take over. I know many of the people who listen to this show are interested in local politics and curious about how Paris is changing, and some of them are actually going to be voting for the first time. So I felt this deserved a special focus. I'm joined by Phineas Rueckert, a Paris-based journalist who covers politics and social issues for The Nation, Jacobin, and New Lines magazine, to help me unpack what's at stake, who's running, why this election is so important, and also what legacy Anne Hidalgo leaves behind. Phineas, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We've got a big month ahead. A lot is changing. Our dear or not so dear Hidalgo is leaving or will be leaving. It's kind of wild because she's been mayor since 2014. Before that, she was Delanoë's adjunct mayor. She's been in the Parisian consciousness and landscape for so long that it's going to feel a bit odd. But so many people seem to be thrilled that her terms are coming to an end. And just as an anecdote, I was with a bunch of journalists, French journalists last week, many of whom would call themselves quite left-wing. And they expressed a level of vitriol toward her that I just simply do not understand. To the point where, anytime she opens her mouth to speak, they feel this rage building in them. That is not, I think, the experience of a lot of foreigners who look to Paris and see this mayor who has radically transformed in a lot of positive ways our city, and who shepherded in the Olympics. And you could argue that, the foreigners who don't live here don't have to deal with the pain points along the way of some of these changes, but you and I live here.
We do.
So I wanted to start here. I wanted to get a sense of what you think the biggest accomplishments have been in her years as mayor and where some of this hate comes from. And really, are Parisians just bound to hate whoever's in charge?
Yeah. Well, so it's funny that you bring up the story of sort of you talking to these journalists. It sort of reminds me of like when I first moved to France, it would have been around 2018. And I was trying to understand like why Hollande, the former socialist president, was also so hated. And I do think it's one of these things where it's like not quite left enough for the left, but not quite right enough for the right or the center, and just sort of like manages to rub everyone the wrong way. And I do think there's a certain amount of that going on with Hidalgo. Like, she's definitely not, shepherding in this sort of like very militant sort of left-wing agenda that maybe someone from like La France Insoumise would want to have or want to see. But she's also not necessarily, going to appeal to centrists. There's obviously a lot of people who are very upset about her in terms of like, oh, I can't drive around Paris as easily. So I do think that there's one of these things where it's kind of hard to understand, and hopefully we can unpack this in the chat. But to answer your question, to go back to what you're actually asking, so Hidalgo in a lot of ways has been pretty successful at reshaping Paris. She has laid out 1,000 kilometers of bike lanes, which in a city the size of Paris is incredibly impressive. To give a little bit of a comparison point, New York City has about 2,500 kilometers of bike lanes. Paris is a fraction of the size of New York. And many of the bike lanes in New York are just basically like lines on the street. Whereas in Paris, it's much more often protected bike lanes, often two-way bike lanes, these sort of almost bike highways through the city, like you'd see in a place more like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. So, in terms of the physical transformation of Paris, it's not just bike lanes. It's also, if you go in front of any school in any arrondissement in Paris now, you will see that the whole sort of street in front of the entrance is blocked off to traffic. There's, greenery everywhere in those areas. The amount of traffic circles that have been pedestrianized where, Place de la Bastille, when I first moved here, was a mess. And now you can actually get around there on bike. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's...
And also, so the big argument, and this is, I don't know if we're going to be able to have the the explanation for this, but many of the changes, including Bastille as one such example, seem to haven't quite curbed the car traffic that she made it seem like we would see.
Often it seems probably worse.
Right. It seems worse. However, we have these results of 50% less air pollution, according to a number of measures. So, it's like there are these things that are coexisting, and the Hidalgo detractors all speak to, the traffic at some of these big circles, the traffic that can't go along, and this has been more than 10 years anyway, but on the banks of the river, the thoroughfare. One person I was speaking to last week was like, I bike everywhere in the city, and the bike lanes that go against traffic on some streets are extremely dangerous. You never should have done that. I mean, isn't the whole point to try things, and then if you have to scale back, you scale back? But these people just seem like every measure is something to pick apart.
Yeah. And I just also think that, the world has gotten more chaotic too. Like there's just more people. Like I know that and Paris has become, each year there's more and more tourists. There was a whole sort of controversy around the dockless, what do you call those?
Lime?
The dockless scooters.
Oh, the scooters, yeah.
Where there was a referendum actually on the dockless scooters, and Parisians voted largely to ban them from Paris.
But there weren't that many people who voted. That was the other thing that got everyone up.
A low turnout vote, which kind of makes sense on any sort of local proposition. But it just there's just a lot going on, and if you don't necessarily live here and you didn't see what it was like before, it could be shocking. I think it could be very, very hard to navigate, especially especially older Parisians, older people in general. I can imagine being in their shoes and being like, I don't know which way to look anymore,
right.
How to cross the street.
Right.
There's just people going the wrong way on a Lime scooter, and then there's bikes crossing very fast.
Yeah.
There's obviously some issues about how people cycle in Paris and
enforcement. I guess at that point, that's the next step.
Yeah. And once in a while, you'll see a few municipal cops, ticketing cyclists or ticketing motorcycles who've gone through the bike lane. But for the most part, it is just sort of this kind of free for all. And I think people get that impression and they think, oh, this failed. But they don't necessarily see what was just a free for all in the past for cars.
Right. Well, there seems to be a real attachment still to cars, as though somehow they are endemic to a city like Paris, which they weren't. It really ramped up after World War II. And so to hear also young people that are like, it's impossible to get around Paris, even the buses can't go fast enough. Is this a Hidalgo problem, or is this something bigger, a social issue, a change issue, or a resistance to change that people have? Or is it a little bit of everything?
It's a good question. I think people are certainly resistant to change, and sort of to come back to, why Hidalgo is quite unpopular. I think a lot of people feel like she was sort of authoritarian in her rollout of this. There wasn't necessarily for every bike lane a citizen, meeting in which the pros and the cons were weighed out and a decision was made collectively, which, to be fair, often does happen in other cities, but which drastically slows down the amount of, in this case, bike lanes that are being built out, because, there's opposition from local commerces, because they say it's going to, the work needed to put those into place is going to mess up their businesses. People are concerned about the way it was done. But then again, you have to, also look at what Paris looks like now and compare it to 10 years ago. And there are many things that have gotten dramatically better.
I mean, also noise, to be honest. Noise was another source of pollution that has improved, maybe not in every area, right? But even where we're recording, parts of the 11th arrondissement were full of loud car traffic, honking.
The motorcycles.
The moped. And, some streets have been blocked off to non-resident traffic. And some people still sort of drive on roads they're not supposed to. But for the most part, that does do a lot to curb some of that noise. And so the reality is if you're driving and you don't have to be driving, that's why you hate it here, right?
Yeah, and if you watch old videos of what the Kid Seine, so the Seine, what is now a walkway, used to sound like, it's just horrible. It's this constant drum, this whooshing of cars over, and then the traffic backed up like way all the way out to the Paris suburbs. It was not better, and that space was totally dead, which is one of the nicest spaces I think in Paris now.
What is concerning is that given that she is going to be leaving, and we don't know who will really be taking over. I mean, we have our hopes, perhaps, and our fears. But if it is someone like Rachida Dati, who we're going to talk about, at one point she was campaigning on undoing some of these changes. Now she claims that she won't touch a lot of it. She is now claiming that she's going to not follow through with the changes at the Louvre to make, navigation better and more secure. Are we at risk, do you think, of seeing a lot of these wonderful changes uprooted?
I think, like you said, probably Rachida Dati, if she were to be elected as the Paris mayor, has realized that something like, bringing cars back to the Kid Seine is a very unpopular measure. I think the only current candidate who is sticking by their guns on that issue is Sarah Knefel. So the far right of the far right from the Rueckert party, which we can definitely also talk about. But I think it's much harder to undo a bike lane than to redo one,
right?
Or than to do one in the first place. And that would also necessitate a large amount of construction, which is the whole part, one of the whole things that people were upset about vis-a-vis the bike lanes being implemented. So I don't see a world in which stuff like that gets rolled back. I just think it would drastically slow down. Because there are parts, like Paris is very much divided, not north-south, as has often been kind of the case, but more east-west. Yeah. And the other day I was cycling in the 16th arrondissement, so like far west of Paris, and there's almost no cycling infrastructure. It's you're there with the buses and the motorcycles on cobblestones. It's right. Very unpleasant, actually. Mm-hmm. So we could just imagine that would just sort of stay that way. It might just kind of stagnate, but not necessarily rolling it back, because that would be both, I think, unpopular and also just complicated.
Right.
Very, very difficult to actually implement.
And also, most of these center right-wing candidates are, unsurprisingly, campaigning on law and order, which is sort of their obvious beat to go on. But the left is where, and this is maybe where we should get into sort of what this is going to look like and why it is so uncertain. So a few things. This is your first time or second time voting next month? This
is my second time voting in a French election of any type. The first time was during the SNAP legislative elections.
2 years ago, yeah.
Was it 2 years ago already?
2024.
Yeah.
Well, so almost 2 years ago.
Almost 2 years ago. In which case I was voting in a ridiculous election in Montreuil between a candidate backed by LFI, so the left-wing party, and then a candidate who had left LFI but was, basically campaigning on the same platform, but just under a different name. It was messy and unnecessary. Right. But okay. So this will be my first time voting in a mayoral election. And
what is different this time, which we were discussing before we started recording, is that there are some changes to how this will go down. Usually the presidential election is a 2-round vote, and actually that is what will happen in March. Previously, and I completely forgot that this is how it went the last time I voted for mayor, was it's one vote, and you're voting for your local council, so in each arrondissement. And then that, according to the number of seats, ends up sort of informing who takes over Paris. This time, though, we've got 2 rounds. So 2 Sundays in a row. The first, again, local council, and then Paris council, who also then determines who becomes mayor. Do you think that's a positive thing? Is that giving us a little bit more reason to take interest in this election? Do you think it will get people motivated?
Well, this is one thing to look up. I'm not sure if it's that you vote first for your local council and then for the Paris council. I think you vote twice for both. We'd have to check this. Maybe you can put this in like the extra notes at the end or whatever. I don't know how you do things. But I think it's you vote for, at the same time, a councillor from your arrondissement, and you vote for the Paris mayor. and then you do that twice, and it's a ballottage sort of system.
Right.
So like
no, I think you are right. Yeah.
And then in the second Sunday of voting, any candidate, both in your arrondissement and in the Paris mayoral race more broadly, will advance to the second round if they get 10% or more.
Right. So if, let's say, someone in the 11th arrondissement already it's a clear win right from the beginning, they might not necessarily be on the ballot
so you
again
might
in
be
the
in a
second
situation
round.
where the first Sunday you'll vote for your local your local arrondissement list, council list, and the Paris council list. Your local arrondissement list, maybe one candidate gets more than 50%, and then it's just automatically elected. Whereas you'll still have to go back the following Sunday to vote in the second round of the Paris one, which 100% is not going to end with someone getting 50% in the first round. And so to answer your question, I think what is quite interesting about this new framework, which is also only the new framework in Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. It's not the case in other cities.
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically, I won't get into the weeds, but it's like a 1980s law that was then changed, or that is now being changed and brought back to, I guess, what was the case before. But all that to say, what this does is it actually opens up a space for candidates who otherwise probably wouldn't have made it to the second round, who can kind of skate by on name recognition. So like we talked about a little bit about Sarah Knafo, so the Rueckert candidate.
Who, for those who might don't recognize her, they might recognize Eric Zemmour, who is the head of that ridiculous party.
Exactly. And so currently, and I'm actually working on a story for this for The Nation, which I'm plugging now. Currently, Sarah Knafo is polling over 10%, which would mean she would actually make it to the second round of the election. But locally, in terms of arrondissement, she has no ground presence at all. But because now you're voting sort of for the mayor, as its own thing, people like her are able to actually make it to the second round. Same goes for Chikirou, who's the candidate for LFI, who's about 10-12% as well. So, La France Insoumise does have some very good implementation on sort of local level and basically in the northeast of Paris. But, much less traction in Paris as a whole. But because of this sort of new system, it's actually possible, and this would be crazy, but it's not, implausible, that there will be 5 candidates in the ballottage second round on the second Sunday. So it would be Emmanuel Grégoire, who represents a sort of coalition, a large coalition of the Socialist Party, the Greens, the Communists, a few other parties. There would be Chikirou from La France Insoumise, Knafo from Rueckert, the Zemmour party, and then Rachida Dati, who's the sort of traditional right/hard right candidate, currently the culture minister of Macron and the mayor of the 7th arrondissement. And then the last candidate who is currently polling above 10% is Jean-Yves Bournazel, who is sort of a center of the road, 3-time. This is his 3rd time running for Paris mayor.
And yet he has almost no name recognition.
But about 15% polling intention.
Interesting. He is associated with the Horizons or Horizon party, which was founded by Edouard Philippe, our former prime minister. During COVID, actually, in the beginning of COVID, he was the one taking a beating almost with his, semi-regular nightly broadcasts. Anyway, he's not unliked by centrists, is what I'll say. So
and so Bournazel is sort of this weird situation where he basically represents the Macron vote, but he's more not so necessarily running for Macron's party.
Right. Okay. So you think he reflects that more than Dati does?
Well, so Macron has basically endorsed, so to speak, Dati, which makes sense because she's, a government minister of his. She's a member of the Les Républicains party, which is the right, the traditional right. So he has sort of, supported her, yet, his party support, in terms of policies, in terms of approach, would more align with Bournazel. So it is a weird sort of situation for the Macronists.
So people who are going to be voting for the first time, they have a lot of individuals to potentially look into and what their programs are. And I didn't do a deep dive on everyone who's center-right, but they all seem to share this kind of like I said, order, security, cleanliness, because they assume Paris is just, like a trash bin. And to that, I want to say, really, have you ever been to New York City? But on the left, we have our own issues because there's a lot of infighting. And this happens every time we have an election. La France Insoumise, which has been wrongly labeled by the government, by the current administration, the extreme left, which technically it is not. And the social coalition you mentioned, but led by the Socialist Party. And there's all this infighting. No one wants to agree. And there was this thought, or at least I assumed that maybe someone would finally learn from their mistakes of allowing these fights to go on, because when you have the far right that is basically storming up the hill, ready to take over the show, and they can't get their act together and be like, you know what, we need to figure out a way to compromise or else we lose the whole operation, they're still not getting it together. What do you think might happen with regards to people who are only going to consider voting for the left?
So yeah, it's very much a mess on the left. What is historic and what is unique in this election is that actually the left is more united than it has been in past Paris mayoral races. So in the past, the Greens Party, the Communists, they have run their own candidate in the first round, and then when their own candidate either doesn't poll high enough or whatever, or decides that there's too much of a threat on the right, then they'll join the party that has the most votes, which has traditionally been the Socialists. Mm-hmm. But actually, what happened this year is that they all came together beforehand, before the first round. And even with that, so that list, that electoral coalition is polling around 32%. The right-wing coalition, or the right wing under Dati, is around 26%. The centrists around 15%. And then basically different variations, because we didn't mention actually that the RN, so the National Rally, also is fielding a candidate in Paris. And so between that candidate and the Sarah Knafo, the Reconquête candidate, they're about 17% for the far right. All of that to say, in general, you could say that Paris is 40% left between the two left parties and 60% right between the center, right, and far right sort of, groups. Which means that the only chance for the left to win the election is either that there are no coalitions that take place between the two rounds, and so they'll just kind of continue being 30% and winning, or that the La France Insoumise, so the further left but definitely not extreme left group, would either take out their candidate, withdraw their candidate, to then have those votes go towards the more center left coalition.
But neither want that to happen, do they?
Exactly. And so basically the socialists who are sort of in charge of this left-wing group have said, we will not do any type of allegiance with La France Insoumise.
And for people who don't know, why is that? Because listeners have heard me talk about Mélenchon on the show. It's been a while since we've had to talk about him, but he seems to be the pariah of the group that, where people who would consider actually voting for the party, as long as he's involved, they won't. I think you have more of an eloquent way of describing why this is.
No, I think pariah is not untrue. Mélenchon is a very polemic figure. He's quite authoritarian. He has a very black and white sort of view of the world. Recently, he even went as far as, I don't know if you followed this, but he went as far as to ban certain journalists from attending a press conference that he held, including Libération, which is like a left-wing newspaper, which, yes, has been critical of Mélenchon, but that's, part of the game. Part of what journalism is, and part of, what, the left can't just be like, all left-wing politicians are great. So, he's this sort of authoritarian figure who has not been afraid to make pretty strong statements about international geopolitics. Often he's been accused, and sometimes rightly, sometimes not rightly, of anti-Semitism
and
pro-Russian kind of links.
Sentiment. Yeah,
he's like a Chavista, so he's very close to the Venezuelan regime. And so, so all of those sort of like international, I think, issues come into this general distrust of Mélenchon from a lot of people on the left, which is too bad because his party actually does have a lot of very progressive ideas that would advance cities or local races. They have been part of left-wing coalitions before, the NFP or the NUPES. And when they were always dragging certain policy issues further to the left, whether that's about, social housing, dealing with unhoused populations.
Major issues though.
that are important. They've been sort of like bringing the ship back to the left. Whereas now, just because their leadership is so negatively viewed, those things are sort of swept under the rug. And then obviously we have to talk about what's currently going on in France, which maybe you've talked on a previous podcast about Quentin Deronck.
No, I haven't actually, because oh God, yeah. Let's get into it, because honestly, this is also part of the vilification of the La France Insoumise, but also a striking example of how divided France is. And so when you think about could France follow in the footsteps of the United States or other nationalistic countries, I mean, there are some parallels. I'm not saying they're identical, but France has its own very serious issues that are also very different from what Italy has gone through. And I've heard so many people talk about, but Giorgia Meloni is not as severe as she campaigned on. And whether that is true or not, the point is that you can't successfully or fairly compare Italy and France because their stories are so different. And we also have a very militarized police here, which I think plays a very big role in what could happen should we move to the right, and how they can be weaponized and used. So all that to say, what happened with this guy who is sort of like, not exactly, but kind of like a Charlie Kirk of France.
So my partner, who's also a journalist, Yann de Vignemont, and I are talking a lot about sort of like the Charlie Kirk aspects of this, and might at some point write a story on that. But essentially, to make a very long and complicated story short, what happened is at basically there was a talk by a politician on the left from the La France Insoumise party, Rima Hassan, in Lyon at Sciences Po, a very venerated university. She is a very polemic figure again. She's very, very vocal about Palestine. She's been, sort of the bugbear of the right and the far right and even the center. So, the fact that she's giving this speech is already sort of creating some sort of tensions. Lyon, you have to know, is like this a very weird city where there's like a very strong like nationalist sort of movement. So it's like sort of the cradle of these like ultra nationalist groups in France. So Rima Hassan, far left politician, giving a talk in Lyon. Obviously, this was very displeasing to the right and the far right. A number of groups from the far right went to protest this talk, which is legitimate. Sure. The left protests all sorts of talks by far right people, and that's how this works. But what essentially happened is during that, sort of on the sidelines of that conference that she gave, there was protests by the far right, and then a group called Jeune Garde, which is like a left-wing anti-fascist group, just confronted the far-right activists. There were some sort of like, it sort of devolved into street battles between the two groups. And sort of a little bit later, one of the members of the far-right groups got sort of isolated from the pack, so to speak.
Who himself, he's well known though among this group, right? Quentin.
Yeah, so he's not known. He's not just some random person. He's an active sort of far right identitarian nationalist,
Christian also, like sort of Christian nationalist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A white man, he's 23 years old, 24. He gets sort of isolated from the group. The rest of the sort of far right group who was there to protest Rima Hassan leaves. He ends up getting basically beaten by La Jeune Garde, the anti-fascist group. And about a day later, he dies. this was about like the worst possible thing to happen for the left. In and it sort of gave credence to everything that the right and the far right were saying about the left, and specifically about La France Insoumise, sort of, creating a demon out of them. And the reason I should say that La France Insoumise comes back into this story is because La Jeune Garde was co-founded by Raphaël Arnaud, who is a left-wing anti-fascist activist initially, and became actually an elected official for La France Insoumise. And one of the people who were later arrested for beating up and eventually killing this far-right activist was a parliamentary assistant of Raphaël Arnaud. So the narrative becomes very quickly, La France Insoumise is the biggest danger for France. They're violent. They're going after, white Christian French people and killing them on the streets in broad daylight, filmed. Like there were several several angles of this were filmed, which of course is not actually the case. The number of people killed by far right groups since the end of World War II is around 50, over 50. This was the fourth person killed by a far left group.
But that is not the framing that we've seen in the last 10 days. We've seen actually, and by the time this comes out, it will have been already 3 weeks or so. Maybe, yeah. But there was a moment of silence required by, what was it, the Assemblée Nationale?
Yeah, the Assemblée Nationale.
Did they do that for any of the figures on the left who had been killed by the right? No.
Just one.
Oh, just one. Okay.
And it took a while for it to happen. And there was
and the media has followed along. All of the basically non-independent titles, essentially, sort of, I don't want to say glorified him, because it wasn't quite like what happened with Kirk, but there was a little bit of a relaxed take on these accusations toward the La France Insoumise, and it really wasn't equitable.
And a lot of this was taken, out of context. Like nobody talked about the street fighting that led up to this. Like the far right activists who were there to protest in the first place. They said that they surrounded themselves with people who were protecting them, which was another far right group. But that other far right group, like there's some photos that way, like you see them, like one of them has a flamethrower and one of them has like a crutch that's clearly not actually for walking, but is like to be used to beat people.
Plus a march that happened in the days following his death. There were neo-Nazis on the street. So all of this, though, when you put this in the context of even the election in Paris, and people are going into it thinking, La France Insoumise is this. And this isn't the first time that this has happened right up before an election. There is some thought that also the U.S. is interfering. I saw headlines about this, perhaps because you've got people in the administration. I think even Kushner said something, about Quentin.
The current ambassador to France, Charles Kushner was basically made a few comments about like the dangerousness of LFI, and then after those comments, which completely go past his role as ambassador to France, he was asked to I don't remember if it was La Assemblée Nationale or a different institution, but he was basically asked by the French government, like, you need to clarify your comments to us, like you need to tell us why you said that, like why you took that position. And he just didn't show up.
Yeah, he didn't show up to the meeting, and so now he's barred from speaking with
exactly. Yeah. But so all of this, just to come back to the mayoral elections, like all of this is all happening in the past 2 weeks.
Yeah.
This is a very bad look on La France Insoumise, regardless of, the context, regardless of what you think about the party, regardless of their platform. Like it's gone way beyond that, because within that sort of left-wing coalition group, there were like some who were more favorable to some sort of second round coalition with LFI, the Greens and the Communist Party more so than the Socialist Party, which also mirrors national level dynamics. There was a possibility, that maybe if the voting, intentions suggested a coalition across the left, maybe that would have happened. Now that is completely dead in the water.
Yeah.
So the question is, will actually La France Insoumise, which is currently polling about 10 to 12%, will they actually hit the 10% number for the mayoral council to make it to the second round. And if they don't, what do their voters do? That's a big question.
Well, right now. I'm seeing if we can take social media for anything, at least it provides some sort of insight, but many LFE supporters are saying they won't vote.
And I think there's going to be a high extension rate to begin with. I think a lot of people are feeling just like no party really represents their interests,
sounds
both
familiar,
on the left and the right.
Jesus, sounds familiar. Yeah, Americans who have dual nationality, we really get pulled through the ringer in some ways. We have to do this twice.
Yeah, it's brutal. It's been a rough couple of years as a binational.
So the one thing I want to make sure we can address for listeners also is, why is this election? I mean, we know that local elections are so important wherever you live. In the U.S., we know this is true. Here, it's especially true because they essentially decide on things that impact your day-to-day life in your arrondissement, right? So we know that. But it also is an indication of how things could go next year because we have the presidential elections. And, we don't start campaigning. We don't have the same unlimited fundraising ceilings as we do in the US. So that election really won't sort of become palpable for, many, many months to come. But so this is what we've got now. Why are the stakes of this election so important, and why should people keep it in mind given what's around the corner?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of comes back to what we were discussing earlier. And it does sound sort of technical, the whole Paris, Lyon, Marseille, they changed the rules and now you vote for your local person and your national person. But I do think that actually gives us more sort of information about what 2027 presidential elections might look like, in the sense that, and this is what my Nation piece is about, is 17% of Paris, the capital of France, is currently polling for the far right, not the right, not Dati, but the far right.
And in which arrondissement?
Mostly in the west of Paris. Right. So the 16th, the 17th, the 8th, right? The 7th. Well, yeah, the 7th, definitely. Even though the 7th is sort of Dati's arrondissement. And so I think, Paris, you can get a little bit more of a sense of where the country is going than if you were to look at a local race in some other place, because usually mayoral elections are about those issues that affect you on your day-to-day life, housing or ecology or education or what have you, healthcare. But these sort of national level dynamics have been sort of grafted onto the Paris race. And so I think that you can say, you can see a little bit more about sort of where things are headed. And, Paris, I think in 2022 voted about 4% for Marine Le Pen.
4%, and now we're at 17 polling at least.
Again, it's between two different far-right parties. Right, okay. There was also Zemmour, who also had, some polling in Paris. But there has been, the far-right has progressed. That's for sure. And if the far-right has progressed in Paris, it's progressing elsewhere, probably even faster elsewhere. The broken left is also the case in almost every other city in France. There's almost no city. I think the only city I can think of where the left, La France Insoumise, and the sort of communists, greens, socialists have created one unique list is in Arles in the south of France.
Oh, yeah.
But otherwise it's, you have LFI and they're doing their thing, and then you have the left and they're doing their thing. There's been two moments in recent French history where all of those left-wing groups came together. And I really, I struggle to see that happening. And going back to the Quentin Deronck thing, that, just kind of what's the expression? It sealed the tomb
yes.
of the broad left coalition with LFI. It seems that, almost impossible at this point.
So given this, is there any ray of hope for you in your mind? You're doing a lot of reporting about this. You've spoken to people on the ground. I'm assuming you've heard people say they just won't vote because it's too much. It's too complicated. No one sort of reflects their needs or their wishes. What is the best case scenario?
I suppose as a journalist, I should probably say I'm, impartial and whatever, and don't have an opinion. But of course, I live here. I'm also a Parisian resident, and what happens in Paris affects me on a personal level. So I recently had a conversation with Jan Brossard as part of my reporting. He is one of the members of the socialist broad coalition list for Paris. And he said something that I thought was quite interesting. He basically said, what happens in Paris is all about, voter turnout. Are like working class populations going to come out? And he basically said, I don't know if I get the exact numbers right, but he said, if there's 10% more people who vote in the 16th, so, the west of Paris, the bourgeois, the people who are supporting the far right, if 10% of people vote there compared to the 20th, so, the top left corner of Paris, very working class, very immigrant heavy, if they vote 10% less than in the 16th, almost certainly the left is going to lose the election. And so what he was saying, and I think he actually has a much better sense of this because he's doing door knocking, he's doing lots of things. He was saying that his biggest concern is that the stakes aren't necessarily well
expressed to people, right? Yeah,
to people.
Of course.
And so I think, and there is this sort of Paris has been run by the left for 25 years.
Yeah.
And so people just assume, the left is going to win. Paris will continue to be a sort of socialist. The continuity candidate is Emmanuel Grégoire, who was involved with Hidalgo's
first
government.
term. Yeah.
Most people just sort of assume that's what's going to happen. And it's not necessarily the case. Obviously, it's going to, because it's this 2-round system, it's what to watch for is how many candidates get that 10%.
And what the turnout is even in the first round, right?
Is, yeah.
I mean, at the very least, you have 1 week to try to rally people who were on the fence or who weren't planning on voting, assuming they're already signed up to vote, right? Because that's another issue. But yeah, it's really disheartening because, as long as I've been a voter, I've learned about, and I don't mean just here, I mean in the US as well, about the importance of local elections. And you can't sleep on this one. You just can't.
And I mean, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but it is kind of hard to know what the right would do if they got into power. Paris has been led by right-wing politicians before, most notably Jacques Chirac, who then went on to become president. But it was a very different world.
I was just going to say the right didn't look quite the same.
The right didn't look the same.
Yeah.
Obviously, Dati has said that she would never make a coalition with the far right of Sarah Knafo. But will she take some of Sarah Knafo's ideas? Sarah Knafo's idea of creating some sort of crazy 2-tiered system where there's cars under that go along the water, and then above the water it's
ridiculous
pedestrians. Whether she would take some of that on and actually try to placate the far right voters is to me definitely up in the air. Their whole thing is security. What does that mean? Are they going to hire a bunch more municipal police officers?
Well, they say that,
probably.
Yeah.
And hiring a lot more municipal police officers, even in left-wing places like Saint-Denis, leads to is often a lot of, racial profiling, violence against minority communities. And we can imagine that, would be exported to Paris. They talk a lot about cleanliness. What does that actually look like? They haven't really necessarily proposed anything very clear on that. What does that mean for, there's 3,500 homeless people living
it's getting
in
worse
Paris
and worse,
at any given moment. What is their policy? Are they just going to get everyone in buses and ship them out to other cities? There's not a lot of clarity on what that would actually look like. But then again, and this is part of what the left has done wrong, is that there's not enough clarity, I think, coming from the left about, okay, what are we going to do differently? How do we differentiate ourselves from Hidalgo, who, again, like we said at the beginning, is highly unpopular? What's our plan to go forward? Yes, we talked about the sort of transformation of Paris. How do you take that to the next level?
Right.
What does that look like?
So this has all been very serious. And I want to just add in something for those who didn't know anything about Sarah Knapfo. You have to at least look at how she has copied Zoran Mamdani's campaign colors and fonts and mirrored some of his videos for social media, including, next stop, Hôtel de Ville. it lacks so much originality that it's quite humorous. But given everything you've said, I don't want to suggest that we should just blow her off entirely, because who knows, right? So I do want to leave people with something actionable for those who are about to vote for the first time. They obviously have a lot of context because of this conversation, but the city sends out brochures in everyone's mailbox with the platforms of all the candidates. If you think that they don't actually express enough of what their measures would actually look like, how do you think people should evaluate their choices?
That's a good question, and it's very funny that it's funny and also concerning the sort of Knafo, like she uses the same font, like her whole thing has been like this sort of like Mamdani-esque positivity, which is really weird actually to see from the far right. Like her slogan is a happy city. And I this is not an original thought of mine. This is from Le Monde, has a podcast called L'Heure du Monde. And recently they did a podcast on the Paris municipal elections. And they actually mentioned that this sort of the Knafo effect, what she's trying to go for is this sort of nostalgia effect of like, sort of bringing Paris back to what it looked like in like the 1950s, which also should ring alarm bells, like by getting rid of immigrants and like, bringing the cars back and all of this stuff. So sorry, that was just a bit of a tangent, but to answer your question, so what to look for, I mean, for me, what I'm looking for, I do think that actually the situation for unhoused people in Paris is untenable. It's getting worse every year. I would like to see a candidate who comes up with a very concrete and actionable plan for housing those folks, for giving them access to, mental health services, for giving them access to physical health services as well. There's a really interesting activist group called the Collectif Le Rueckert. Mm-hmm. It actually started as activists who are trying to use the Olympics as a way to shed a light on the situation for people living on the streets of Paris. And they've since sort of reworked their platform to orient towards the municipal elections. And they've been contacting all of the different candidates with a very concrete plan. Here is what we, as people who are on the ground, say, have seen and what we want to see from you as politicians. And actually, they organized an event a couple weeks ago where everyone but the far right, all of the candidates but the far right or representatives of those candidates were on stage together talking about that proposal and basically being questioned, what will, this element of our proposal, will you do this? Will you do this? And it was really interesting. I was at that event. It was really interesting to see that. So, that's one thing that I'm looking at.
And just because, people are going to wonder, did anybody have anything convincing to say?
So, I think the two different left parties, both pretty much support all of the different elements of this. But what was a bit too bad was they sort of used that moment as an opportunity to just bash on one another about previous things. Like you didn't do enough on this issue when you were in Paris, you were leading Paris for 25 years. Why didn't you do that? Which is valid. Right. It's a valid thing, but there wasn't this sort of like, there's a common threat, sort of, we need to get together and sort of, align on this. And then the sort of the different right-wing groups sort of said, well, we mostly want to adapt most of this, but here's our little sort of right-wing spin on it. What's interesting about that is this sort of not deference to NGOs, but this sort of inclusion of NGOs, of people who are on the ground to actually make policy, which is something that I think, might give a little bit more hope to people about the way politics is run. If you can know that the people who are actually on the ground, who are actually working with, in this case, it's unhoused people, but, the same thing could be said for like anything from, education to healthcare. This having more sort of citizen input, I think would be something, very positive. And this does seem to be starting a little bit, and groups like that are really important in making that happen.
Otherwise, people should just look at what the candidates are saying about the issue that feels most important to them.
Exactly. Yeah. And like that is a thing that's nice about France, is that everyone sends you their program and you can look it through the program. actually a lot of people don't necessarily even vote until they, or, decide who they're going to vote for until they've read through all of the physical brochures.
Yes. There are websites, but people often wait for the mailings.
Yeah. For me, I think, homelessness is a very important issue. I've written a lot on this, reported a lot on this. For the next person, it might be, education. There has been some sort of link, some scandals linked to education
huge.
in Paris, which we definitely don't have time to get into.
No.
That's a whole other topic. But, I think for, parents, people with young children, like that could be a crucial. And so they want to see, concrete sort of promises on that.
Well, so maybe we're going to need to do a follow-up after the election results
Let's see what happens in the first round.
TBD.
Send me a message.
It's a TBD, but at the very least, it will be interesting to follow what happens after the 22nd of March. And we're going to cross our fingers, I guess.
Yeah. First round, March 15th. Second round, March 22nd. Both are Sundays. Those will be very interesting days also to and that's what I'm planning on doing, just walk around Paris and sort of talk to people and see how they're feeling, see, whether there's any protests or whether there's any types of like public, manifestations. It's gonna be interesting and
just in time for spring.
Just in time for spring. Hopefully the sun level will have gone down far enough that we can actually go and talk to people also along the riverbanks, because currently that's not very possible.
No, it isn't. Phineas, thank you for this explainer and for the reporting you do, which I will link to in the show notes.
Thank you for having me.
That's the show for today. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to check out the poll related to this episode by scrolling down in your app. There are more exciting conversations to come this season, so I hope you'll subscribe or share the show with a friend if you've been enjoying what you've heard so far. As always, you can find more from me at lindsaytrimuta.com and at the New Paris Dispatch on Substack. À très bientôt.